Dear people watching and listening, Assalamu alaikum. Kindly like and share this video and subscribe to my YouTube channel. Please support my channel by contributing to my Patreon account so that I can continue making the audiobook series. The last chapter, start of chapter 26. A pause for reflection. Having come this far in our narrative of conquest, we have got to the threshold of one of the greatest and most epoch-making events of Muslim history, viz. The conquest of Spain. This event led to 8 centuries of Muslim rule over Spain, sometimes over all of it, always over part of it, one of the most romantic and most glorious eras of human history, and one with the most tragic ending. But a description of that event must await the next work of this writer's pen, the 4th volume of this Muslim military history. The present volume had as the limit of its scope the completion of the conquest of North Africa, which in turn was to act as a springboard for the launching of the Spanish venture. And the reader has already been introduced to the leading personalities involved in that launching. Musa bin Nusayr, Tariq bin Ziyad, Count Julian. But we must pause to digest what we have covered so far in part 2 of this book. There is a lot to digest. It might appear to the casual reader that the Muslims kept going aimlessly in and out of North Africa, back and forth, as if some blind impulse drove them in and a counter-impulsive drove them out. We must pause to reflect upon these movements, the seesaw campaigns of the Muslims in North Africa. We must try and see the military sense of all this, and there was not always military sense behind these movements. We must try and understand the reasons behind these military ventures, and these varied. We must get some idea of the generalship displayed by the Muslims, the overall design of which these campaigns formed part, how well the campaigns were conducted, how well the bloodshed was justified, how well the outcome fitted into the design. We do not have very much to go on. There is not a great deal of detail available about the campaigns and battles, and what is available has been described into this volume, with the coordination of early accounts which often vary and at times conflict. What is written in this chapter, therefore, is an estimate, a brief analysis of the conquest, to place before the reader a military perspective upon which he may further reflect. Reading the accounts of 10 campaigns in as many chapters, following closely one after the other, might give the reader the impression that all this was one war. This is an illusion. It was not one but 10 separate wars, spreading over more than half a century, connected only in the sense of geographical location and of the enemy being the same, the Muslims on one side and the Berbers and Romans on the other. In our own time we have seen the First World War, the Second World War and the Korean War fought within a time span of 40 years, with the belligerents often the same. Yet we never think of these 3 major wars of our century as one war. It is our distance in time from the 7th century and the fast narrative of these chapters which create the illusion that all these Muslim operations were part of one single war. We must bear in mind that time and space are interrelated. In matters of movement, one is relevant only in relation to the other. 50 years of the 7th century was a longer period than the entire 100 years of the 19th and 20th. Space has shrunk. The world is now a smaller place. Time has shrunk. A journey which then took 3 months can now be completed in 3 hours. Today, a division can be airlifted over 3,000 miles in a few days. Then it took a month for a fast messenger to travel from Africa to Damascus, and 4 months for a body of troops to travel from Damascus to the Maghrib. In terms of space, Damascus was over 3,000 caravan miles from Carthage. It was about as far from Damascus to the borders of China, and that was far enough away for the Holy Prophet to imply that China was at the end of the earth. to which Muslims should be prepared to travel in quest of knowledge. The Maghrib was at the other end of the known world. Muslims getting out from Arabia would know about as much about the Maghrib as we now know about Mars. In between were deserts and mountains, uncharted and unknown to man. This is the time and space background against which Muslim operations in North Africa should be judged. They should also be judged against the military knowledge and ethics of the 7th century, not of the 20th. It is a common error made in our time to impose our ideas of sense and ethics upon a people with different standards, living in an age when many of these ideas were just not relevant. The external politico-military thrust of Islam was stronger in lands bordering the Arabian heartland than in regions farther removed. As this thrust went into farther lands, it lost momentum, interest dwindled. Only the more far-sighted and more resolute of the Muslim leaders could see the virtues of penetrating deeper into the external world. This politico-military thrust was ably directed by Caliph Umar, in whose time most of the lands around Arabia were conquered. He sustained this thrust until the Muslim state had acquired manageable borders from the point of view of geopolitical stability. The Arabian Peninsula, Egypt, Palestine, Syria, Persia, and parts of Armenia. To some of the military ventures of his time, Umar only reluctantly agreed, but having agreed, he pursued his objectives with unrelenting determination. Once he had acquired the right borders, he put a stop to further military expansion and held his generals back with a strong hand. After Umar, for the next half-century, the caliphs were burdened with internal discord. The Muslim state was plagued by civil war. This ended with the death of Abdullah bin Zubair, caliph at Mecca in 73 Hijri, although revolts and bloody uprisings went on. And after this, Caliph Abdul Malik bin Marwan was able to devote more attention to external conquest. His aims, however, were purely political, compared with the religious inspiration of the first four caliphs. The motives underlying the African expeditions varied with the caliphs who launched them and the generals who led them. These motives fall into three broad categories, some less tangible than others. First, there was the destiny of Islam. Every great movement has a destiny which must fulfill itself, an impetus which must expend itself, and all obstacles that stand in its path must fall as if pulled down by an unseen hand. This applied with special force to Islam, the last, the greatest and the most dynamic of the God-inspired religions. Then there was the religious spirit linked with the factor of destiny, which gave beauty and romance to Islam's military ventures. In spite of the decline of religious motivation, with the abdication of Imam Hassan in 41 Hijri and the assumption of the caliphate by Muawiyah, the world of Islam was full of slaves of Allah, who saw no ideal more worthy than service to Islam, and who sought merit with Allah by fighting the enemies of Allah. The finest examples of this religious motivation were uqbabinnafe, Zuhair bin Qais, and Hassan bin Nu'man. They were unworldly generals fighting worldly wars, and their armies boasted thousands of believers with motives as pure and as noble as their own. But this spirit manifested itself more in the armies which fought in North Africa than in the governments at Damascus which launched those armies. The last factor, and by no means a minor one, was plunder. Since soldiers did not receive regular pay, and this was common practice in much of the world at that time, what the soldiers took in battle amounted to their pay. The prospect of booty was undoubtedly a factor that drew Arab warriors to Africa. But it was not a dominant factor. All soldiers were volunteers. They were not pressed into service and did not have to go to the front. The idea of an Arab from the Hejaz leaving home, often without his family, and going 4,000 miles away through some of the most inhospitable countries in the world, to fight some of the most bloodthirsty adversaries in the world, with the likely possibility of never seeing home again, just for the chance of acquiring booty does not make sense. Plunder was one factor and nothing more. The very first expedition to North Africa, that of Abdullah bin Sa'd bin Abi Sarh in 27 Hijri, was motivated by a desire for plunder, pure and simple. Caliph Usman sanctioned the expedition because it would bring in more money for the treasury at Medina, and because it was simpler to let a persistent fellow like Abdullah bin Sa'd have his way. The second expedition in 45 Hijri was a half-hearted attempt by Caliph Muawiyah, always an exploratory measure to have a crack at Africa once again. He never told his general, Muawiyah bin Hudayt, to establish permanent Muslim rule in North Africa, and Muawiyah bin Hudayt contented himself with winning a victory over the Romans and collecting a great deal of booty before returning to become governor of Egypt, which post he valued more than leading military expeditions into foreign land. These two generals, Abdullah bin Sa'd and Muawiyah bin Hudayt, had no great religious or moral stature. The third expedition in 50 Hijri was a more serious attempt by Caliph Muawiyah to take Africa and incorporate it into the domain of Islam. This time he chose the right man to command the expedition, uqbabinnafe. However, petty politics and partisanship on the part of the governor of Egypt, resulting in Uqba's dismissal and the replacement by a favored but less deserving subordinate, delayed the westward progress of Muslim arms. The campaign of the Maghrib by Uqba after his restoration was entirely his own idea and inspired by the sole desire to serve Islam and spread the word of God. Uqba's successful campaign in the west established a commitment which could not be reversed. The fourth invasion, in 69 Hijri, by Zuhair bin Qais, and the fifth and sixth in 73 and 79 Hijri, by Hassan bin Noman, were in the nature of a restoration and re-establishment of Muslim rule. It was Uqba's campaigns which formed the high water mark of the conquest, not only because he fought the hardest and went the farthest, but also because after him there could be no going back or staying back. The appointment of Musa bin Nusayr had no great purpose behind it. It was an event of chance, the last of the army commanders in the conquest of North Africa, and the one who was to acquire the most lasting fame because of Spain. He actually just slipped in. Had he not been suspected of embezzlement, history would never have heard of him, and he would have ended his days as an obscure revenue official in Basra. It was his fear of Hajjaj, governor of Iraq, that led him to flee Basra and seek the protection of his patron in Egypt, which in turn led to his appointment as governor of Africa. The fact that he fully justified his appointment as governor of Africa and the Maghrib by his labors and ability is another matter. It is not easy to assess the generalship of the commanders who led these expeditions into North Africa. We lack detailed knowledge of their plans and operations. The first two can be dismissed simply. They showed no generalship and were content to let others do the fighting for them. Uqbabinnafe was a fine battlefield commander and possessed a very high degree of tactical skill, but he showed scant regard for strategical principles. He led his army to its near destruction in the high Atlas range, and it was only the eruption of inter-tribal warfare among the Berbers which saved it from annihilation. But perhaps he scoffed at strategy. He was a romantic, inspired by the higher ideals of holy war and martyrdom. His plunge into the Atlantic, mounted on his horse, was typical of the man. Zuhair bin Qais and Hassan bin Noman were cast in the same mold. They were inspiring generals who went into battle with the sword in one hand and the Quran in the other. Not enough is known about their battles to judge them as army commanders, but the fact that they won their battles suggests that they were sound tactical commanders. And they won these battles not just against wild Berber hordes, but against well-organized and sophisticated Roman armies as well, led by seasoned Roman generals. Musa bin Nusayr was to become a towering figure of history, not so much for what he achieved in North Africa, but because of Spain. He was a man of drive and ambition and possessed organizational and administrative talent of a high order. In military operations, he showed himself to be more of a strategist than a tactician, guiding the operations of his subordinates, and very soundly, rather than getting involved in them himself. But unlike Uqba, Zuhair and Hassan, he was a worldly man, and his time saw more Berbers dragged into slavery and more towns pillaged than in earlier Muslim times. Because of his love of wealth and the harsh methods by which he acquired it, perhaps because of his avaricious masters in Fustat and Damascus, Musa never achieved the moral stature of his three predecessors. Ultimately, he came to a bitter end, but that is outside the scope of this volume. Beyond these brief judgments, nothing can be said about the generalship of the Muslim commanders in North Africa. Since the final test of generalship is victory in battle, they were good generals. They passed the test. It must be kept in mind, however, that the plans and movements of some of them were deeply influenced by their desire to earn merit with Allah by fighting unbelievers, even to the exclusion of strategical wisdom. They were generals, but they were also holy warriors. In entering the land of the Berbers, the Muslims clashed with the fiercest enemies they had met in their history, or were likely to meet for a long time. The courage and toughness of the Berbers, their resilience in recovering from one bloody defeat to come back for more, their tenacity in resisting the Muslim advance generation after generation, faced the Muslims with the kind of opposition which even the brave Persians had not been able to muster. But the harder the Berbers fought, the more they suffered. They proved themselves a courageous and honorable nation, and if ultimately they fell in war, others too had fallen before the relentless advance of Islam. The fact that the Berbers were not one compact, centrally controlled nation but a disunited race of warring tribes, sharing a racial and cultural rather than a political and military community, worked in favor of the Muslims. Even within smaller geographical regions and districts, the Berbers displayed a lack of unity typical of a tribal society. They were brave and skillful as individual fighters, but lacked the organization and generalship needed to take collective advantage of that courage and skill. On the two occasions when they did find unity and leadership under Kusela and the High Priestess, they were able to turn the Muslims out of Africa. But these were merely the delaying actions of history. In the end, the Berbers had to fall and submit to Islam, and with this submission rise again as a great warrior people. It was a mark of the high military quality of the Muslim Arabs that they were able to wrest victory in battle against such ferocious enemies, numerically so much stronger and often guided by able Roman officers. They worsted the Berber in every battle, with the sole exception of their first clash with the High Priestess. What the Muslims went through in their marches and their battles is a glowing tribute to their courage, faith, and military prowess. This is especially true of Uqba's campaign of the Maghrib and his operations in the High Atlas. No army has earned a higher place in the military hall of fame than Uqba's army of the Maghrib. The behavior of a people or a society on the political and ethical plane has to be judged according to standards prevailing at that time. The best way for us to seek a standard of judgment for this period is to study the Eastern Roman Empire at Byzantium or Constantinople during the period of the conquests described in this book, that is from 640 AD, the start of the invasion of Egypt, to 707, Musa's reconquest of the Maghrib. Byzantium is often extolled as a brilliant center of culture and civilization, heir to both the Roman and the Greek traditions, which we are told was damaged by the rising power of Islam. It is worth reminding ourselves how good Rome was. Its military quality was unquestionably high, but we should know more about the political and ethical condition of the empire. And then, with that as a background, we will be in a better position to form an opinion about Muslim actions in North Africa. Moreover, the Romans have been with us through 3 books, and will not be with us in the future as we enter Spain. They are almost like old friends, and it will be nice to see how they have been doing. The brief summary that follows in the next few paragraphs is based exclusively on Gibbon's Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. Heraclius was the Roman emperor when Amrbinalaas invaded Egypt. He ruled for 31 years and is acknowledged as one of the great emperors of Rome. When his first wife died, leaving behind a son named Constantine, he contracted an incestuous marriage with his niece Martina, and the superstitious Greeks believed that the deformity of their son Heracleonas was due to the wrath of heaven. Before his death in 641, in his last testimony, Heraclius declared both his sons as equal heirs to the throne and instructed them to honor his widow as mother and sovereign. But shortly after the death of Heraclius, his elder son, Constantine too, died, allegedly poisoned by Martina. As a result of this, Martina's tongue was amputated and her son, still a boy, was deprived of his nose. The elder of the poisoned emperor's 2 sons mounted the throne at the age of 11 as Constans II and was to rule for 27 years. He was the one who was defeated at sea in the Battle of the Masts in 34 Hijri by Abdullah bin Saad, and it was in his time that the first and second invasions of Africa took place. He grew up to be a heartless tyrant. Fearing that the Senate might appoint his brother Theodosius as co-emperor, he forced him to take holy orders and become a monk, which disqualified him from the throne. Not satisfied with this, Constans later had his brother killed. This led to the multitudes coming out in the streets, clamoring for the emperor's blood, and this drove the latter into permanent exile. He settled down in Sicily, where he was killed in his bath by an attendant hitting him on the head with a vase. This happened in 668. The people of Sicily placed the crown on the head of an obscure youth of indescribable beauty. In Constantinople, the eldest of the dead emperor's 3 sons was placed on the throne as Constantine IV, and he at once set out to reconquer Sicily. The island was taken and the beauteous head of its ill-fated young king was sent to Constantinople for display at the hippodrome. Another noble youth, Germanus, who refused to kill his own virtuous father, was punished with castration. Many years later, when there was an unsuccessful revolt against him, Constantine suspected his 2 brothers of having a hand in it and promptly had their noses cut off, and this man died a natural death in 685. His son Justinian too was proclaimed emperor. There was more vice, more luxury, more cruelty. Taxpayers who did not pay their taxes were suspended head down over a slow and smoky fire. An eunuch appointed as minister in charge of the palace had the emperor's own mother whipped. For 10 years the people groaned under an oppression which became progressively more unbearable. Then they rose. The uprising was led by a general named Leontius. The emperor was overthrown and sentenced to the loss of his nose. But the operation was not neatly done, with the result that he still had a bit of his nose when he was exiled to the wilds of Tartary. He wandered among the Khazars and the Bulgars. Meanwhile, after 3 years, the general was overthrown and mutilated by another rebel who assumed the name of Tiberius as he ascended the throne. And he lasted 7 years before the exiled, half-nosed Justinian returned with an army of Bulgars to conquer Constantinople and reclaim the throne after a 10-year absence. Under Justinian's orders, the 2 usurpers who had ruled during his exile were dragged to the hippodrome in chains and cast beneath the emperor's throne. He planted 1 foot on the neck of each wretched ex-emperor and sat thus for more than an hour watching the chariot races. Later, after slow tortures, the two rebels were killed. Justinian's cruelties became even more inhuman as he sat about to punish those who had supported the two rebels or had insulted him during his exile. It was 2 years after the return of Justinian II that Musa bin Nusayr reconquered the Maghrib. We now say farewell to Rome, while it is ruled by the beastly mutilated Justinian. He had only another 4 years to live until 711, when he was overthrown by an army revolt and executed along with his son. Thus ended the dynasty of Heraclius after a reign of 101 years, to be followed by the Isaurian dynasty. This was the Rome from which the Copts and the Berbers were delivered by the invading armies of Islam. It is against this Byzantine background that we form a correct picture of the condition of the new Muslim order, the stability, the law and justice, the discipline, the peace and prosperity. The Muslim conquerors saved the Berbers and raised them to their own level as brothers in Islam. Now a Berber could be a governor and a general, like Tariq bin Ziyad at Tangier, which was unthinkable in the time of the imperial and imperialistic Romans. The Muslims fought, killed and took plunder, but this was the custom of the time. All those taken in battle were captives and slaves, and this happened with all armies. If the Muslims shed more blood in North Africa than in other theaters, it was because their enemies fought more stubbornly and kept coming back for more. The Muslims themselves suffered as much when they lost to the Berbers. Those were cruel times in terms of physical violence, judged by our 20th century Red Cross ethics. However, it is to their credit that they did not kill or plunder outside battle. There was no question of Muslim soldiers wantonly killing people in towns and villages, not at war with Muslim power. And it is to their credit that they always offered terms before battle and scrupulously avoided harming communities which accepted the terms, acceptance of Islam or payment of the jizya, a poll tax imposed upon non-Muslims, usually 2 dinars per head per annum. This was not done by armies before them, nor by armies which came after. Prophet Muhammad (sallallahu alaihi wasallam), on whom be peace, had said, "There will always be a group of my followers in the Maghrib, fighting in the way of the truth till the coming of the hour." The prediction had to come true. The Muslims have always been there, in North Africa, fighting the way of the truth. End of chapter 26. End of the book, The Muslim Conquest of Egypt and North Africa.